When a seminarian is beginning his formation, he is always assigned to a spiritual director. That typically is a priest who he meets with at least once a month to discuss how formation is going, burdens or struggles or any areas that he's having a hard time with. Well, for me, as I began as a young seminarian, they assigned me to one of the auxiliary bishops. They must have known right from the start that I needed extra help. But in being assigned to Bishop Madden, I was very intimidated to be meeting with him. I thought, wow, here I am, a new seminarian, to be meeting with a bishop. And so as I look back over our conversations, there were many times that Bishop Madden would say, "Do you understand what I'm saying?" And I didn't. Do you know what I'm asking you to do? And I said, yes, but I really didn't. But one case in particular, he was referencing a movie, and he said the movie title is called "Oh God," starring John Denver. He said, "I'm sure that you've watched that." "Yes, Bishop, yes, I did." But in the back of my mind, I was thinking, who is John Denver? But I was so curious after he referenced this movie that when I returned back to the seminary, I found the movie and I watched it on YouTube. It's a wonderful movie. If you haven't seen it, George Burns plays God. And there's a perfect scene at the very end where George Burns, playing God, says he's going to be leaving. And John Denver is just beside himself because he's grown so close to God, aka George Burns, that he cannot fathom what life will be like without the wisdom and direction of George Burns. And so he says, "But you're leaving. What's going to happen if I need your help or I just want to get some guidance?" In the final words of the movie, George Burns says to him, "You talk and I'll listen. You talk and I'll be listening." I realize that if you had someone else here today preaching, they would come up with a much more theologically significant or deep definition for prayer. But for this guy, that's the best that I've ever heard prayer described. That we are speaking to God and we know that He's listening. The reason I mention prayer is today in our second reading from St. Paul to the Romans, St. Paul reminds us of a truth that you and I have wrestled with in one capacity or another, despite our age or life experience, and that is our inability to understand God. St. Paul says so clearly that the Lord's judgments are inscrutable and unsearchable His ways. I think the only way to grasp even some understanding of who God is in the midst of prayer. But to understand prayer from the context that we are speaking and God is listening. But in order for us to enter into such a conversation with the Lord, it is essential for us to at least know what the Lord is not. Because too often we attribute to the Lord things that could not be further from the truth. The first is that whenever we experience pain, sickness or illness, a broken relationship, a disappointing friendship, what very often we say is that God is testing us. That in this moment, God is watching to see how I'm going to respond in this moment of turmoil. A God that loves us so much that would send us pain or illness or somehow rejoice in watching relationships fall apart, it is impossible to think that that in any way is God. The other is that when a loved one passes away, what is often said is, God took her to Himself. God brought her home. And again, I realize, especially in moments of loss, that we look for some type of certainty or logic to what we're experiencing. But notice what happens when we begin to attribute to God this sense that He causes pain and suffering, that He plants people in our lives called our moms and dads, spouses, siblings, people that we love, and that God rips them out of our lives. You see, what happens is that in the moment it somehow makes sense to our limited comprehension. But notice what that does long term. When we begin not just to think, but to believe that God causes all of these terrible things? How do we enter into a prayer where we feel confident to speak to him, let alone trust that he's listening to us? And so when we say that God's ways are unsearchable and unfathomable, it's meant in the context that it's beyond our greatest expectation. That when we recognize that our God is a God that loves us, it means then that when we look to sickness and illness, a God that loves us is not sending that. Instead, where is God in the midst of sickness? God is present in the doctors and nurses, not in the pain and suffering. God is present in those individuals that he has gifted with talents to help us and our loved ones when we're sick. Where is God in the midst of death? God is not the one that causes death, but rather God is the one that says that when our bodies fail, not him, but when our bodies fail, God promises that for those who love him, that he does not allow death to be the end. But for those who love him in this life, he promises us eternal life in the next. The death for those that love him, it's not the end, but rather a beginning. But my brothers and sisters, let me be clear that as I've touched upon sickness, illness, and even death, I do not stand before you today proposing some exact formula that I fully understand exactly how God governs the world. I don't. But what I can say is that it's best for us to remove from our hearts and our minds what is not God in order to somehow grow closer to know what God is and who God is. Bishop Barona, a great homilist, compared this reading today to children. And he said that as we grapple with understanding the magnitude of who God is and his judgments in the world, he likened it to infants and toddlers. He said if infants and toddlers had the ability to speak, he said that they would echo the words of St. Paul, how inscrutable are your judgments and unsearchable your ways. And this may seem trite, but again, think from an infant or toddler's perspective. He or she in his or her limitedness doesn't understand why someone that loves him or her takes them to a man or a woman dressed in a white coat and pokes and prods them with needles. Or why is it when an infant or toddler is having fun that they're forced to go to bed or go to school? Or for me, the worst memory of childhood, eating broccoli. But imagine that despite the limited perspective in that moment, all of those elements that were deemed as being hurtful and painful were actually, in the grand scheme of things, healthy and fruitful and good for us. That we needed those immunizations. We needed to have a good pattern of sleep. We needed to eat fruits and vegetables so that we could grow to be adults and enjoy the many blessings of this world. In the moment, it was impossible for us to understand. But now we have the hindsight of grasping how all of those elements fit together for our good. My brothers and sisters, perhaps that might be true in our relationship with God. That in those moments that we do not understand, that we almost feel as though, why is God sending this to us? Instead of quickly and falsely looking upon the Lord to be some vengeful, wrathful God, to remember those palpable moments in our life when we knew God to be a God of love. And we cling to those moments so that when we do not understand God, we make that simple prayer to the Lord, Lord, I don't understand, but I know that you love me. And in some place and in some day, I will fully understand why this is happening. But brothers and sisters, it's not enough for us to simply reflect on this truth for an hour here at Mass, but we need to pray. We need to pray in the quiet of our hearts, in our homes and in our workplaces, whatever works for us. If we're a morning person, to pray first thing in the morning. If not, maybe in the evening. If we have a long commute in the morning, perhaps turn the radio off. If we're waiting in line for something, instead of getting frustrated, allow that moment to be a time for prayer. And in addition to our formulaic prayers of Our Fathers and Hail Marys, in addition to that, to allow our prayer to the Lord to be a conversation. Lord, first, I give you thanks for the blessings that I clearly see that you've given me. But Lord, I also just don't understand. I need help because I'm frustrated, hurt, or confused. Be confident that we can say that to the Lord. His shoulders are broad enough not simply to receive our praises, but to also hear our questions, our doubts, our frustrations, and even our struggles. But brothers and sisters, if we're going to pray to the Lord and have a conversation with him, asking to understand what is beyond our comprehension, let us also have the courage and confidence to hear how the Lord is going to respond. Because the Lord is listening. He's listening to every single prayer that we offer, because he is a God of love. And so, brothers and sisters, as we gather here this day, we look to the Lord, who is many times beyond our understanding, not because he wants to frustrate us, but because his love is beyond what we can ever fathom. In the midst of what we do not understand, may you and I pray, and pray unceasingly. Talk to the Lord. Talk to him every day, for we know that prayer is an opportunity for us to talk to the Lord and to have every confidence that he is listening.